and welcome to LexisNexis Risk Solutions Facing Change series. I'm Mike Harris, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Barry Robinson of BDO in Ireland. BDO is a broad-based advisory firm with a global reach. So Barry, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mike.
So let's start perhaps, Barry, by just asking you about what you do. Tell us about BDO and your work.
Yeah, so BDO is a global accountancy firm, and in Ireland here we advise companies in the domestic and international markets to grow their businesses. And I work as part of the risk advisor and forensic team here at BDO, and we advise companies on their risks and internal controls and assist in any internal investigations when issues come to light that need to be investigated.
Why do you think that bribery and corruption hasn't historically received the necessary and perhaps full attention of Irish companies? And what are the areas of risk that Irish firms have probably been more concerned with, particularly during the present time? And was it an issue that was being ignored, or was it simply not there?
I think, Mike, that bribery and corruption has been viewed by companies in general in the past as relatively low risk in Ireland. I think more recently, cyber attacks, anti-money laundering, and data protection have been the focus of more attention for boards of companies. Really, since 2014, since the introduction of the New Companies Act here in Ireland, there's been a suite of new legislation introduced by the last government, which has brought about a lot of regulatory change in Ireland, and companies have been getting to grips with that. But in 2017, the government then announced a package of white-collar crime measures to bring Ireland's laws really up to international comparison with other countries. And as part of that, in 2018, they introduced the Criminal Justice Corruption Offences Act. And I think that's come in somewhat under the radar, but it should really be treated with the same importance as all of the other pieces of legislation.
And for Irish firms in particular, what new anti-bribery corruption risks do you think have emerged in the supply chain, and which industries are particularly at risk?
With shortened supply and increased demand, that will always bring about a risk of the potential for bribery and corruption. The companies need to be aware of and try to manage that risk the best they can. These purchasers need to be clear about their policies and how, like for example, their gift policies and their purchasing policies when acquiring goods that are in short supply. The use of agents, the use of gifts to induce payments and purchases. I think everyone, on both sides of that transaction needs to have proper procedures in place. In terms of the public sector, then with the increase in stimulus, financial packages that have been announced by various governments, including in Ireland, there's also a need, the reminder of the importance of transparency and how companies and industries lobby for public funds. So health sector and the public sector have been identified as two of the main industries and sectors with this increase for risk.
You mentioned, Barry, just now the Criminal Justice Corruption Practices Act of, I think, 2018 that came into being. And we've spoken previously, and you said that it goes further than most other countries, including the UK Bribery Act. So how is this? How does it go further?
The UK Bribery Act requires that there were adequate procedures in place. And we've seen that in a UK case called Scanson, where they actually self-reported, and the UK courts decided that that wasn't enough to show that just because you identified the bribery and corruption and that you reported it, that wasn't an adequate procedure in itself to prevent that. So the warning signs are there for companies in other jurisdictions around that. But the Irish legislation actually requires, I'm just quoting from Section 18 of the Act, that a company will have to demonstrate that it took all reasonable steps and exercised all due diligence to avoid the commission of the offence. And I think those phrases are quite far away from the adequate procedures provisions in the UK Bribery Act.
Interesting. So if you're an Irish business or you're an Irish-based company, then really you need to have a close look at this legislation in the terms of what it means, in terms of the obligations it places on you as a firm and as a business.
Yeah, and there will be great debate and even perhaps court challenges as to what is meant by all reasonable steps and exercising all due diligence. But I mean, I would ask Irish companies and urge them to look at their policies and procedures and to see what, in practical terms, they can do to actually take reasonable steps and carry out due diligence on their customer base, on the supply chain, on their business partners, and that they have some kind of monitoring tool or some kind of system that allows them to record their due diligence and the steps that they're taking to prevent bribery and corruption in their organization.
So just turning our attention to the external, the market, we see all around the world that firms, that countries are increasing their efforts to fight financial crime. How important is it to Ireland's commercial success that it's seen as leading that fight and being strong against fraud and financial crime in general?
So it is important that we're transparent. It is important that we have in place strong laws, strong regulations, and strong regulators to encourage these companies to come here and to encourage business, but also that we can be prepared that if Ireland then becomes a haven for the target of bribery and corruption, that regulators have the powers to be able to, investigate and enforce against that.
Ireland has attracted many high-profile companies from not just the US, but many other parts of the world too. And as it carves out or seeks to carve out a new role as a tech hub post-Brexit, many of these international firms will be used to working with strict anti-bribery and corruption compliance regimes, obviously, from the countries that they are already having to do that in. So what more do you think Ireland needs to do to support these global players as more of them come in and establish business in Ireland?
Perhaps the government agencies in Ireland, they might take a greater role in educating their clients and their firms. The companies, a big push post-Brexit to diversify and export goods into new countries. But maybe an education piece and training around the risks of doing certain business practices and avoiding the risk of bribery and corruption when doing business in countries you've never done business in before would be of help to many companies, and awareness of the legislation.
Very important, clearly. And that leads me in really to ask you, Barry, what advice would you give to Irish businesses about the steps that they should be taking to ensure that, let's say, if the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau pays them a visit, they can demonstrate that they are fully compliant with the requirements of the Act? What would you say to them?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say is really to take a step back and conduct an overview of their whole approach to bribery and corruption. But then to not just put that away in a drawer and do nothing with it, to actually take steps, those reasonable steps, to demonstrate that they are looking at their business partners, their supply chain, their customers, and monitoring and identifying instances of alleged bribery and corruption, bad practice, any kind of allegations that they could actually be caught up in and that could cause them reputational damage. That might be through the use of ad hoc audits or through internal audit or just having an external review on an annual basis to ensure that all their records are kept up to date. It goes back to that piece in the legislation that if there is, an allegation or an issue that they're on the end of an investigation, that they can demonstrate to a regulator or to the courts that they took all reasonable steps